Today in the EU, AI Act voted in Strasbourg, military security issues omitted. It's plenary week in Strasbourg and MEPs are gathering to vote on the last files left for this mandate. One of the files to be finalised is the Artificial Intelligence Act. Although the EU's legislative text was adopted in mid-February, it still needs to be ratified by the Parliament. But is this truly the endgame, and what are the concerns expressed regarding the use of AI in military defence? Hello and welcome. I am Evichori, and this is Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. To dive into this topic, I'm joined by Elisa Gkritsi, Euractiv's technology editor, and Aurélie Pugnet, our defence and security reporter. Elisa, starting with you, just to break this down for our listeners, what does this vote mean, and what can we expect to happen this Strasbourg?
EU member states don't have to adopt this legislation until it's voted on, but it is expected that it will pass after many, many years of negotiations.
So what happens once it's voted on?
So once it's voted on, it will be published in the journal, and then 20 days after that, it comes into force. But the full implementation of the act is not set for 2 years after that. Whereas some things like prohibitions, like specific systems that are prohibited, are set to take effect in 6 months. And then other things are set to take effect in a year. There's a slightly longer deadline of 36 months for high-risk AI systems.
Lengthy also procedure, but also quite complicated.
Yes, it makes the calendar very colorful and blocked out. And there are also guidelines and standards that will need to be written up. So good luck to all the lawyers.
Good luck to you covering all this.
Good luck to me covering this, yes.
The AI Act has previously encountered many challenges and several delays in the past years already. Indeed, feels like a never-ending story, as you just described.
Yeah, so this has been 3 years in the making.
And as a matter of fact, these delays have been the source for inside jokes here in Brussels.
So I'm so very glad to whoever is behind the Twitter account, Is There a Deal on AI Act, is finally able to put with all the letters that there is a deal and close the account.
When the Spanish presidency announced the finalization of the AI Act, it addressed the parody account on X, Is There a Deal on AI Act, that made fun of the delays and all the meetings that happened. But moving from this, can you give us some background on how we got here?
I think what's quite interesting is that in that time, we also saw the rise of ChatGPT and image generators, which ChatGPT is supposed to be the most quickly used tech product of all time. And I wasn't around to follow that very closely. From what I've read and heard, there were some specific sticking points that sort of came to a head last year. One crucial one was foundation models.
And what are the foundation models?
These are AI systems that are more general purpose and sort of also maybe require less human intervention in their training, like ChatGPT. So they're more powerful. And last November, there was a situation where the negotiations had almost come to a sort of breaking point because the parliament wanted a horizontal approach, so all of these models would be regulated
the same way.
The same, whereas some countries wanted them to have a tiered approach, and in the end they settled in a tiered approach.
Does a tiered approach make more sense in this case, or?
I mean, it makes more sense within the sort of general regulatory framework, because what we have is these tiered approach in which you classify some things as high risk or high importance. But, exactly how this plays out, we will see, because there's a lot of factors at play.
And now looking a bit more at the legislation itself, can you give us an overview on what is that we're looking at exactly?
Yeah, so we can think of it similarly to the GDPR with a risk-based approach. I think that is very important. We have some straight-out prohibitions, which is cool. This includes most types of biometric identification, with some exception for law enforcement, in cases of abductions, trafficking, terrorist attacks, imminent threat to lives. Also, social scoring is banned. And then there are sort of high-risk systems, which include the use of biometrics, but also any AI system used in critical infrastructure, education, anything that could affect voter behavior, anything that pertains to like your access as an individual to essential services. I think what's quite important to know is that there is a special AI office that's being generated under this, and there was quite a bit of back and forth on what that actually means. Initially, it was set out to be like a very independent agency, but it looks more like it will be integrated within the Commission.
Now, you've also been following the Council of Europe's Convention on AI, where there are suggestions regarding the protection of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And the AI Act has occupied a primary position in this convention. Why is that, and what does it mean in practice?
So they're supposed to somewhat like go together. The AI Act is an EU regulation, like we have to enforce it, we have to
understand it better, make legislations.
It's like very specific, or well, it will eventually be even more specific and technical. The Convention on AI, Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law is a more like general treaty. You can think of it as, that type of international treaty on human rights. And it was a very ambitious thing to take on because it was going to be the first international treaty of its kind, specifically meant to protect human rights within the context of AI. But now what we've seen more recently is very important carve-outs, including perhaps national security applications of AI, and also maybe perhaps even like the private sector will be sort of carved out, and then the member states that will sign on to this convention will be able to opt the private sector into the convention. So it's like quite weakened than what was originally planned.
Now, the other element that is highlighted and needs to be discussed and resolved is the implications artificial intelligence may have on security and defense. Aurélie, coming to you now. AI is very important for the military, and usually when you hear these words together, there are concerns regarding security, and this legislative text doesn't really include this aspect. Why is that?
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't. The regulation actually says that it only applies to the civilian purposes of AI. So what that means is if you have anything that is in a drone, for example, that can target people and, well, basically shoot them, if it's used for the military, it's not regulated by this new law. But if it's used for the civilian purposes, then it is. It really shows that these are two very different worlds. The military is regulated by their own governments, really.
So then it's national concerns.
Exactly. It's actually the French that asked for this specifically, because the thing is, the armies do use AI. They need it for a lot of purposes, to make the decision processes faster, to process information, intelligence. Then in the military, you always have this idea of you have to have a human in the loop. There is always a human that does identify the target, does hit the button to say, yes, please shoot.
So the military cannot be based on AI?
No. For now, in a lot of government policies, it cannot. But the thing is, can you really know at the end if it is or not? For NATO, so for the military alliance, the Western one, there is a strategy on AI. It does say, well, you do have to have a human. And so that just means that when the industry produces, manufactures a product that has AI in it, for whatever the reason, it's not just about, okay, here you go, I'm taking a decision to shoot that person. It's also just processing information. It's identifying things on a picture. It's not always about killing, but it has a military purpose.
So NATO is taking this into consideration,
yes,
but
is.
It looks like there is no specific EU-wide regulation for this.
At all. No. So the EU is not regulating on that, and it's for national security purposes, and that's for the governments to regulate. And each government takes its own decision as to how it wants to conduct its military operations, and it doesn't want to be told by a regulatory body. That is the
Brussels what to do.
That being said, there needs to be a regulation.
Do you find this problematic, though?
I do find this problematic. Maybe the EU is not the right place to find an agreement. Politicians and officials would say, well, maybe the UN is the best way. But then you'd have the Westerners and like China and Russia are on the same table agreeing on the same laws. They did it. Like, you have treaties on that, international treaties.
But then there is the risk that the message will be lost in translation here.
Definitely. And I mean, you can always not respect a treaty. You'd have to know exactly in the process or in decision making whether a human was actually involved or not. And for now, you have several steps where, well, a human is involved, but having no human at all, it sounds a bit dangerous, doesn't it? I mean, when you see like just cars driving themselves and they can still kill someone, and you have those videos all around the internet.
And it comes what you mentioned before, the sense of responsibility.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, it's in the end of the person that takes the decision. And that would be for each government to set up its own law, and then for the chain of command militarily to decide as who takes that responsibility. And it's a matter of responsibility, but it's also a matter of you have to take the decision. So the speed is a huge factor in this, and you have to have a right level of awareness, of situational awareness, and of knowledge of the situation to know whether that decision is the right one to take, whether you use AI or not. So it is a bit problematic.
And now that we've clarified the concerns regarding security and defense, Elisa, what's worth keeping in mind from the vote in Strasbourg about this topic?
There's a lot to be figured out, and they have clauses to review the AI Act itself. So no, I wouldn't say it is set in stone. I think also what's quite interesting with how the AI Act will play out is that, well, we already have a lot of technology, and it's not made in Europe, and it's very powerful, and it's things that people are already quite used to using in their daily life or their work. And secondly, there's already a lot of legislation or guidelines globally on AI. So with GDPR, there was a situation where the EU was like setting this landmark legislation. It was the first, major block, let's say, to do that, major market. But now with AI, we have other laws, we have other guidelines. So it might also not have like the same influence as the Data Protection Act. But, we'll see.
Thank you, Elisa. Thank you, Aurélie, for this insightful conversation. I am Evkiori, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news. Sign up for our podcast newsletter. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcast. This episode was produced by myself, Miriam Sáenz de Tejada, and Nicoleta Yonta. Thank you for tuning in. We will be back tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.